Ray had seen bad places before. He had worked in field hospitals built from torn canvas and broken crates. He had treated soldiers in ditches filled with mud and rain. He had pressed his hands against wounds in the middle of firefights, with bullets cutting through the air above his head, and he had never once looked away from the person bleeding in front of him. Bad places were not new to Ray. He had lived inside them for most of his adult life. But this place was different. The cell was deep inside the Varek detention facility, far below the upper levels where the lights still worked and the air still moved. Down here, everything was still. The walls were thick black stone, smooth and cold, and they pressed in from every side like the inside of a sealed box. There were no windows. There was no furniture. There was nothing on the floor except a thin layer of grime that had built up over years of use. A single strip of pale light ran along the ceiling, flickering faintly, casting more shadow than brightness. Ray had been dragged through 7 different corridors to get here. He had counted them. Counting things was a habit he had picked up early in his career, back when he was still a young medic trying to stay calm during his first real deployment. Count the steps. Count the doors. Count the breaths. Counting gave the mind something to hold on to when everything else was falling apart. The Varek guards had not spoken to him during the walk. They were tall and thin, with pale gray skin and wide flat eyes that reflected light the way a fish's eyes did. They wore dark uniforms with no markings Ray could read. They had taken his communications unit, his identification tags, and his boots. They had left him with his uniform jacket, his trousers, and the worn canvas medic pouch that was strapped across his chest. He had assumed they left the pouch because they did not know what it was. He had not corrected them. When they reached the cell door, one of the guards pressed a panel on the wall and the door slid open. It made no sound. Ray had half expected them to say something, a warning, a sentence, an explanation of what he had done wrong and what his punishment would be. But they said nothing. One of them placed a hand flat against his back and pushed, and Ray stepped through the doorway, and then the door slid shut behind him, and he was alone. Or so he thought. He stood still for a long moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. The cell was larger than he expected. It stretched back further than the entrance suggested, widening toward the rear like a wedge. The far end was mostly in shadow, and for the first few seconds Ray could not see clearly what was there. Then he heard it. It was a sound like breathing, but wrong. Too slow, too heavy, with a wet pull at the end of each exhale that Ray recognized immediately. He had heard that sound before, in triage tents, in the back seats of evacuation vehicles, in the quiet moments after a battle when the fighting was done and the real work began. It was the sound of something in pain trying to keep going anyway. Ray's eyes finished adjusting. In the far corner of the cell, curled against the wall, was the largest living creature he had ever seen in person. It was enormous. Even folded in on itself the way it was, it filled most of the back third of the cell. Its body was covered in scales that were so dark they were almost black, though in the faint light Ray could see faint traces of deep blue running through them like veins in stone. Its limbs were long and heavy, ending in wide clawed feet that were tucked underneath its body. Its head was broad and flat, with a short, dense structure of bone ridges running from the top of the skull down toward the jaw. Its eyes were closed. Ray had been briefed on the Vreth during his early weeks aboard the station. Every human posted to the outer sectors received the same briefing. The Vreth was used by the Varek as an enforcement creature. It was placed in cells with prisoners the Varek wanted dead but did not want to kill directly. The creature was described as an apex predator with no known capacity for restraint or negotiation. The briefing had been very clear on one point in particular. No one placed in a cell with a Vreth had ever come out alive. Ray stood at the entrance of the cell and looked at the creature in the corner, and he breathed in slowly through his nose and out through his mouth, the way he always did when he needed to think clearly. The Vreth had not moved when he entered. It had not raised its head. It had not opened its eyes. Its sides rose and fell in that slow, labored rhythm, each breath carrying that same wet, dragging sound that Ray had noticed immediately. Its massive body was still except for that movement. The claws on its feet were loose against the floor, not gripping, not braced. Ray took one careful step forward. Nothing happened. He took another. The breathing continued, unchanged. Slow. Heavy. Wrong. Ray had treated human soldiers, and he had treated wounded animals in the field when circumstances called for it, and he understood that the principles were largely the same. A creature in pain was not always a creature that would attack. Sometimes pain made a living thing go very quiet and very still, because movement hurt and the body's only response was to stop moving and wait for something to change. The Vreth was waiting. Ray moved forward slowly, keeping his steps soft and even, keeping his hands visible at his sides. He did not look directly at the creature's face. He had learned a long time ago that direct eye contact with a frightened or injured animal could be read as a challenge, and the last thing he needed right now was to make this situation more complicated than it already was. He stopped about 3 body lengths away and crouched down low, bringing himself closer to the creature's level. Up close, he could see more. The scales near the creature's midsection were not lying flat the way the rest of them were. They were raised slightly, pressing outward in a way that suggested swelling underneath. The skin between several of the scales was darker than it should have been, with a faint discoloration that Ray had seen enough times to name without hesitation. Infection. It was deep, and it had been there for a while. The creature had not been injured recently. This had been building over days, maybe longer, untreated and worsening in the cold of the cell. Ray looked at the Vreth for a long moment. Then he looked back at the door, solid and sealed behind him. Then he looked at the observation panel set into the upper corner of the wall, where he could just make out the faint glow of a monitoring light. He thought about the guards. He thought about the briefing. He thought about what the Varek expected to happen in this room. Then he unclipped the flap of his medic pouch, reached inside, and got to work. Ray did not rush. That was the first rule he had learned, back when he was still a trainee medic watching his instructor work on a soldier who had taken shrapnel across the side of his abdomen. The instructor had moved slowly and deliberately, as if there was all the time in the world, even though there was not. Ray had asked him about it afterward. The instructor had said that rushing told the patient something was wrong, and a patient who believed something was wrong would tense up, pull away, make the work harder. Slow hand said everything is under control. Slow hand said I know what I am doing. Slow hands kept everyone calm, including the person doing the work. Ray kept his hands slow. He opened the medic pouch carefully, folding the flap back without any sudden movement, and began going through the contents quietly. The pouch was not large, but it was well packed. He had organized it himself, the same way he had organized every medic pouch he had carried for the last 11 years. Cleaning solution in the left front pocket. Rolled gauze behind it. Sealed antiseptic strips in the middle section. A folding blade, small and thin, used for cutting away fabric or debris around a wound. A set of curved clamps. Adhesive wound closures in 3 different sizes. A small tube of broad-spectrum antibacterial compound that he had carried for 2 years and hoped he would never have to use on something this serious. He laid several items out on the floor beside him, moving quietly. The Vreth had not reacted to his approach yet. Its eyes were still closed. Its breathing continued in that same slow, painful rhythm. Ray studied the area of raised scales more carefully now that he was closer. The discoloration was worse than it had looked from further away. There was a greenish tint to the skin between the scales near the center of the swelling, and a faint smell that Ray recognized and did not like. The infection had been sitting untreated long enough to begin producing that particular odor. That meant it was well established. That meant whatever had caused the original wound had happened a significant time ago. Ray reached out one hand, slowly, and let it hover just above the nearest raised scale without touching. The Vretha's eye opened. It was a large eye, deep amber in color, with a vertical pupil that contracted sharply in the dim light as it focused. It moved to Ray's face first, then down to his outstretched hand, then back to his face. Ray did not pull his hand back. He did not move at all. He simply stayed where he was, crouched low, hand extended, and let the creature look at him for as long as it needed to. Several seconds passed. Then the Vreth moved. It was not a small movement. The creature shifted its weight with a speed that was startling given its size, pulling its head back and opening its jaw wide enough that Ray could see rows of heavy teeth and the dark interior of its throat. The sound it produced was low and resonant, somewhere between a growl and a grinding vibration that Ray felt in his chest more than heard with his ears. It was a warning. Clear and direct and impossible to misread. Ray pulled his hand back slowly, sat back on his heels, and waited. He did not stand up. He did not move away. He simply settled into a lower, less threatening posture and looked slightly to the side of the creature rather than directly at it, and he waited. The growl faded. The Vreth watched him. Ray waited a little longer, and then he spoke. Not loud, not sharp. Just a low, even murmur, the same tone he used when he was sitting beside a wounded soldier who was frightened and in pain and needed to hear a human voice more than they needed anything else. He said it was all right. He said he was not going to do anything the creature did not allow. He said he could see it was hurting, and that he understood what that felt like, and that he was not there to make things worse. The Vreth did not understand his words. Ray knew that. But he also knew that tone carried meaning that words did not, and that living things, regardless of what they were, could generally tell the difference between a voice that meant harm and a voice that did not. The creature's jaw closed slowly. Ray waited another few minutes, then reached out again, this time moving even more gradually than before, giving the Vreth every opportunity to track the movement and decide how it felt about it. His fingers made contact with the edge of one of the raised scales, the lightest possible touch, barely pressure at all. The Vreth growled again, lower this time, less sharp. Ray kept his hand exactly where it was and kept talking, low and steady, until the growl faded again. Then he applied the smallest amount of additional pressure, just enough to feel the heat radiating from beneath the scale, confirming what he already suspected. The tissue underneath was inflamed. Significantly. This went on for a long time. The Vreth snapped at him twice more during the early hours. The first time, Ray pulled back and waited without any visible reaction, giving the creature no drama to respond to. The second time, he did the same. Each time, he came back. Each time, he started again from the beginning, slow and patient, voice low, movements deliberate. Outside the observation panel, figures had gathered. Ray had noticed the monitoring light change twice, which usually indicated camera adjustments. He had also heard, very faintly, the sound of movement behind the panel. He did not look toward it. Whatever the Varek were doing out there was not his concern right now. By the middle of the day, the Vreth had stopped growling when Ray touched the area around the wound. Ray took that as permission. He uncapped the cleaning solution and applied it to a folded square of gauze, working carefully, cleaning the surface of the skin between the scales first before attempting anything further. The creature flinched and pulled in a sharp breath, and Ray stopped and waited, and when the tension eased, he continued. It took a long time. The wound beneath the scales was deep and ragged, the edges swollen and pulling apart slightly from the pressure of the infection underneath. Ray cleaned it methodically, working from the outside edges inward, removing debris and built-up material with a patience that was simply part of who he was. He applied the antibacterial compound in a thin, even layer, talking the whole time, keeping his voice at that same low, constant murmur. When he finally sat back and looked at what he had done, it was not enough. Not yet. The infection would need more than one treatment. But it was a beginning, and beginnings mattered. The Vreth exhaled slowly and let its head rest heavier against the floor. Ray looked at it for a moment, then began repacking his pouch. Behind the observation panel, no one said a word. The second day was harder than the first. Ray woke up on the floor of the cell with his back aching and his mouth dry and the kind of stiffness in his joints that came from sleeping on cold stone with nothing underneath him. He lay still for a moment, looking up at the flickering strip of light on the ceiling, and took stock of where he was and what he had to do. It was a habit he had developed during long deployments, when waking up disoriented could cost time that nobody had to spare. Find your location. Check your body. Identify your priorities. Then move. He sat up slowly. The Vreth was awake. It was watching him from across the cell with that same steady amber gaze, its great head resting on the floor, its breathing a little less labored than it had been the day before. Not much. But a little. Ray noticed it immediately because noticing small changes was what he did. He nodded at the creature the way he might nod at a patient he was checking on in the morning. Then he reached for his medic pouch and got to work. The second treatment went faster than the first, though faster was still not fast by any ordinary measure. The Vreth allowed him to approach without growling this time, which Ray took as a significant development. It flinched when he removed the previous dressing, pulling in that same sharp breath, and Ray stopped each time it did and waited and talked until the tension passed. The wound looked slightly better at the edges but worse in the center, which was not surprising. Infections often looked worse before they looked better, as the body responded to treatment and began pushing the damage toward the surface. Ray explained this to the Vreth while he worked. He knew it did not understand him. He had accepted that from the beginning. But he had also learned over many years of working with frightened and injured people that silence was its own kind of pressure, and that filling the air with a calm voice cost nothing and helped more than most people expected. So he talked. He talked about the wound and what he was seeing and what he expected to happen over the next few days. He talked about the cleaning solution and why it stung and why that was actually a sign it was doing something useful. And then, because there was nothing stopping him, he started talking about other things. He talked about Earth. He described the field hospital where he had done his first real rotation, a temporary structure set up on the edge of a wide flat plain, surrounded by dry grass that turned gold in the afternoon light. He talked about the smell of that place, antiseptic and dust and something like rain always on the edge of the air. He talked about the soldiers he had treated there, young men and women who had come in frightened and left steadier, not because the fear was gone but because someone had sat with them through it. The Vreth listened. Ray knew that was probably not the right word for what the creature was doing. But its eyes stayed on him while he talked, and its breathing stayed even, and it did not pull away from his hands, and that was close enough. By the fourth day, something had shifted. Ray could not point to the exact moment it happened. It was not dramatic. There was no single gesture or sound that marked the change. It was more like the way dawn worked, where darkness became light so gradually that you could never say precisely when one ended and the other began. But on the fourth day, when Ray sat down beside the Vreth to begin the morning treatment, the creature moved its head. Not away from him. Toward him. Just slightly, just enough that its broad flat skull came to rest a few inches from Ray's knee. Ray looked down at it for a moment. Then he continued with the treatment, because that was what needed doing, and he did not want to make a larger moment out of it than the creature intended. The infection was receding. Slowly, but clearly. The discoloration between the scales was fading at the edges, and the swelling had reduced enough that the raised scales were beginning to settle back toward their natural position. The smell was improving. The wound at the center was still open and would need continued care, but the trajectory was good. Ray had seen enough infected wounds to know when something was turning a corner, and this one was turning. He told the Vreth it was doing well. It exhaled slowly through its nose, a long warm breath that moved the air around Ray's arm. On the fifth day, the guard came. Ray heard the door mechanism before it opened, that faint pressurized click that preceded every entry. He turned to look, expecting the usual distant observation. But the door opened fully, and one of the Varek guards stepped inside. He was not one Ray recognized from the walk down. He was younger looking, with a sharp, satisfied expression that Ray had seen on certain kinds of people before and never liked. The guard looked at Ray and said something in Varek that Ray did not fully understand, but the tone was clear enough. Mocking. Contemptuous. He glanced at the Vreth with an expression that suggested he found the entire situation amusing, and then he looked back at Ray and said something else, gesturing toward the creature in a way that was deliberately dismissive. Ray said nothing. But the Vreth moved. It did not move the way it had moved on that first day, the sharp startled shift of a creature in pain reacting to a perceived threat. This was different. This was slow and deliberate and enormous. The creature uncurled itself from the floor with a weight and a purpose that filled the entire back half of the cell, rising to its full height in a single continuous motion that seemed to go on longer than should have been physically possible. Standing, it was larger than Ray had fully appreciated. Its head nearly reached the ceiling. Its shoulders were as wide as the cell door. It looked at the guard. It did not make the grinding growl it had used with Ray in the early days. It made something else. A lower sound, steadier, with a resonance that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside its chest and radiate outward through the floor and the walls. The kind of sound that did not need to be loud to be understood. The guard understood it. He was outside the door before Ray had time to fully register that he had moved, and the door slid shut, and the cell was quiet again. The Vreth lowered itself back to the floor, slowly, and settled beside Ray with its head near his knee, exactly as it had been before. Ray looked at it for a long moment. Then Dr. Sarah's voice came through the observation panel, quiet and careful, as if she was not entirely sure she should be speaking at all. She said she had been studying the Vreth for 9 years. She said she had reviewed every recorded interaction the species had with every other living being across all documented history. She paused for a moment before she finished. She said that what she had just watched had never happened before. Not once. Not in any record she had ever found. The Vreth had never chosen anyone. Until now. The argument started before Dr. Sarah had finished speaking. Ray could not hear it directly. The observation panel was sealed and the walls were thick, and whatever was happening on the other side of that glass was not meant for him. But he had spent enough years in field hospitals and command tents and makeshift operation rooms to know what an argument looked like even when he could not hear the words. The monitoring light above the panel had been switching rapidly for the last hour, which meant the camera was being adjusted repeatedly, which meant multiple people were moving around out there, changing positions, stepping forward and stepping back the way people did when a conversation became heated and bodies started moving with the emotion behind the words. Ray sat against the wall with his back straight and his hands resting on his knees and watched the light flicker. The Vreth was asleep beside him. Or doing the closest thing to sleep that it seemed to do, which was a state of deep stillness with its eyes closed and its breathing slow and regular. The wound on its underbelly was healing well. The swelling was almost entirely gone now. The discoloration had faded to a faint shadow of what it had been. Another few days of treatment and Ray believed the infection would be fully cleared. He had told the creature this that morning while changing the dressing. The Vreth had pressed its head briefly against his shoulder in response, a gesture so deliberate and so quiet that Ray had stopped what he was doing for a moment and simply stayed still and let it happen. He thought about that now, sitting against the wall, watching the light flicker above the panel. He thought about what Dr. Sarah had said the previous evening. He had not responded to her at the time, not because he had nothing to say but because he had needed time to sit with it first. 9 years of study. Every recorded interaction across all of documented history. And nothing like this had ever happened before. Ray was not a man who thought of himself as remarkable. He was a medic. He found wounds and he treated them. That was the entire description of what he did and who he was. He had never won anything. He had never been promoted beyond the rank his skills required. He had simply shown up, every day, in whatever broken place needed him, and done the work that was in front of him. That was all he had done here. The monitoring light changed again, and this time it stayed changed, fixed in a new position, and Ray heard something he had not heard before through the panel. Not words. Just the faintest trace of raised voices, more than two, overlapping in a way that confirmed what the flickering light had already suggested. They were not agreeing out there. Ray stood up slowly, careful not to disturb the Vreth, and walked to the center of the cell. He stood there for a moment, looking at the observation panel. He could see the faint shapes of figures through the dark glass, moving, gesturing. He could not make out faces or details, but he could see enough to understand the shape of what was happening. He took a breath. Then he spoke toward the panel, in a clear and steady voice, the same voice he used when he needed to be heard across a noisy triage area without shouting. He said he knew they were watching. He said he had known since the first day. He said he understood that what had happened in this cell was not what they expected and not what they planned for, and that it had created a problem for them that they were now trying to solve. He paused for a moment to let that settle. Then he said the Vreth had never been a weapon. He said that was a role they had assigned to it, not a thing it had chosen or a thing it was. He said what it actually was an animal in pain that had been placed in a cold cell and left to suffer because suffering made it more frightening and frightening made it more useful. He said he had walked in here with a medic pouch and done what any person with basic training and basic decency would have done, which was treat the wound that was in front of him. He said every patient deserved care. He said that was not a complicated idea. He said it did not become less true because the patient had scales. The shapes behind the glass had gone still. Ray held their gaze for another moment, then walked back to the wall and sat down beside the Vreth, and said nothing more. The next several hours were the quietest the cell had been since he arrived. Dr. Sarah came to the panel late in the day. Ray heard the soft sound of the communication channel opening, the faint crackle that preceded her voice, and he looked up toward the glass. She said she wanted him to know that she had compiled her full findings and presented them to the Leadership Council. She said her report covered everything she had observed over the past several days, the wound, the treatment, the behavioral changes in the Vreth, and the incident with the guard. She said she had included every data point she had and had not softened any of her conclusions. Ray asked her what her conclusions were. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said her conclusion was that the Varek had been keeping a sentient creature in deliberate pain for institutional purposes, and that a human medic with a canvas pouch and 11 years of field experience had done more for that creature in less than a week than the entire conglomerate had done in all the years it had been held here. Ray said nothing. Dr. Sarah said the leadership was divided. She said one faction wanted him removed from the cell and executed quietly before the situation attracted any wider attention. She said another faction believed that removing him would destabilize the Vreth in ways that could not be predicted or controlled, and that the risk was too significant. Ray looked at the Vreth sleeping beside him. He thought about the guard who had come into the cell. He thought about how fast that door had closed. He said he thought the second faction had a reasonable point. Dr. Sarah made a sound that might have been a short, tired laugh. Then she said the debate had been referred upward. She said the final decision on his situation would not be made at the facility level. She said he was being summoned before the Grand Council of the Varek Conglomerate, and that a transport would come for him within 2 days. Ray absorbed that information for a moment. He asked if he would be coming back to the cell after the council session. Dr. Sarah did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was careful. She said she did not know. She said that was one of the things the council would decide. Ray nodded slowly, more to himself than to her. Then he reached over and placed his hand gently on the Vretha's broad, warm flank, the way he had done every evening since the 3rd day, and the creature stirred slightly in its stillness and then settled again, breathing slow and even in the quiet of the cell. Ray stayed where he was and waited for whatever was coming next. The Grand Council chamber was the largest room Ray had ever stood in. It was built into the upper core of the conglomerate's central station, a vast circular space with tiered seating that rose in wide rings from the floor all the way up to a domed ceiling that was so high above that the details of it were lost in distance. Every seat in every tier was occupied. Ray had stopped trying to count the different species represented somewhere around the fourth tier. There were too many, and too varied, and his mind kept catching on details, the way one group communicated in low vibrational pulses he could feel in his feet, the way another kept their upper limbs folded in a posture that in humans would have indicated deep suspicion, the way the light in the chamber shifted slightly depending on which section of the room you looked at, adjusted automatically for the visual needs of whoever was sitting there. It was overwhelming, if he let it be. Ray did not let it be. He stood in the center of the floor, in the open space that the tiered seating curved around, and he breathed in slowly through his nose and out through his mouth, and he found the still place inside himself that he always found when a situation was serious and falling apart was not an option. Beside him, the Vreth sat. That had not been planned, as far as Ray understood. When the transport team had come to collect him from the cell 2 days prior, the Vreth had risen and followed without being directed, and the transport team had been in no position to argue about it. Dr. Sarah, who had accompanied the process, had made the decision on the spot to allow it. She had told the facility director that separating them at this stage carried risks that the council would not thank them for, and the facility director had looked at the Vreth and agreed without further discussion. So the Vreth had come. And now it sat beside Ray on the floor of the Grand Council chamber, its great dark body still and composed, its amber eyes moving slowly and calmly across the tiers of seated representatives the way Ray's eyes moved across a triage area. Taking everything in, making quiet assessments, deciding nothing required immediate action. The chamber had gone completely silent when they entered. Ray had heard silences of many different kinds over the course of his life. The silence of a field hospital in the early morning before the casualties arrived. The silence of a room when a patient stopped breathing. The silence of a command tent when news came in that changed everything. But he had never heard a silence quite like this one. It was the silence of hundreds of beings across dozens of species all stopping at exactly the same moment, all processing exactly the same thing, all arriving at exactly the same realization simultaneously. The galaxy's most feared creature was sitting on the floor next to a human and looking at the room with the relaxed patience of something that was exactly where it chose to be. The council director, a tall Varek elder with deep-set eyes and a formal banded collar that indicated the highest level of institutional authority, spoke first. His voice was processed through a translation system that rendered it in flat, even tones. He said Ray had been brought before the council to account for the situation that had developed at the detention facility. He said the council would hear his account. He said Ray should speak plainly and completely. Ray said he intended to. He started at the beginning, the way he always started when he was giving a field report. He described entering the cell. He described what he found. He described the wound, the infection, the degree of deterioration, and his assessment of how long it had been left untreated. He used plain language and specific details, the same way he wrote medical reports, without drama and without editorializing, simply saying what he had observed and what he had concluded and what he had done in response. The chamber stayed silent throughout. Then Ray paused, and his voice stayed level, but what he said next was different in character from the field report that had preceded it. He said the wound had not been fresh. He said the infection had been developing for a significant period of time, long enough that any basic examination would have identified it. He said the Vreth had been in that cell, in that condition, for long enough that the infection had reached a stage that without treatment would have become fatal. He said that the Varek Conglomerate, which operated the facility and was responsible for the creature held within it, would have known this or should have known this, and had done nothing. He let that sit for a moment. Then he said he did not believe this was an oversight. He said a creature in severe pain was a creature that was more aggressive, more unpredictable, and more terrifying. He said that a creature that was more terrifying was a more effective tool for the purpose it was being used for. He said he was a battlefield medic with 11 years of experience and no political authority whatsoever, and even he could see that keeping the Vreth in pain was not an accident. It was a decision. It had been made deliberately, and maintained deliberately, because it was useful. The silence in the chamber had changed quality. Several representatives in the upper tiers had begun communicating with each other in low rapid exchanges. The council director's expression had not moved, but something behind his eyes had shifted in a way that Ray recognized. It was the look of a person who had hoped something would not be said aloud and was now adjusting to the fact that it had been. Dr. Sarah, seated in the witness tier to Ray's left, placed her findings on the record at the council director's request. She read her conclusions in a clear and careful voice, and she did not soften them. The chamber received them in the same changed silence. Then something happened that no one had anticipated. The Vreth made a sound. It was not the grinding warning growl that had emptied the cell of the Varek guard. It was not the low resonant alarm that Ray had heard in the early days. It was something else entirely, a sound that Ray had never heard from the creature before, layered and sustained, rising and then settling, carrying a quality that moved through the air of the chamber in a way that was difficult to describe but impossible to ignore. Dr. Sarah looked up from her documentation. Her voice when she spoke was very quiet. She said she needed a moment to be certain. She cross-referenced something on her record quickly, and then she looked up again. She said the sound the Vreth had just made was documented in only 3 historical records, all of them ancient, all of them incomplete. She said the closest translation the research had ever been able to produce for it was a sound of naming. Of identification. Of saying, to a room full of witnesses, this one. This is the one who is known to me. The chamber was absolutely still. Ray stood in the center of it all and looked at the Vreth beside him, and the Vreth looked back at him with its calm amber eyes, and neither of them moved. The council voted before the end of the session. Ray was released. The use of the Vreth as a confinement instrument was suspended immediately pending full review. Dr. Sarah was appointed to lead that review. In the weeks that followed, the story moved across the galaxy the way quiet things sometimes do, not loudly, not all at once, but steadily, passing from one person to the next, growing as it traveled. It was told differently in different places. Some versions made Ray braver than he was. Some versions made the council more villainous than the truth required. But the core of it stayed the same everywhere it went. A healer had been thrown into a room meant to be his end. He had found something suffering inside it. He had done the only thing he knew how to do. And the rest had followed from that.